Welcome to What Happens Next. These are our occasional monthly observations on what's happening in the political and public policy space. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm your host, and we do this as part of a partnership between us, myself, Charles Ellison. I'm publisher of the bnote.com, also principal chief strategist of BE Strategy, more at thebnote.com or strategybe.com, and also Stefan Hankin, who is president, CEO, founder of Lincoln Park Strategies. Go to lpstrategies.com. He's also president of trendancy.com. Go to trendancy.com for more there. And Justin Wallen, who is principal chief strategist at J. Wallen Opinion Research. Go to jwallen.com for more there. So I know that was a mouthful, but I just wanted to make sure I introduce all the experts during this monthly roundtable. Good to see you both. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Great to see you.
Happy New Year.
All right, excellent. So what do you make? So we're at the top of the year. We have a new administration starting up. Also, we've got confirmation hearings for a whole spate of cabinet appointees. So first, let's start off with this incoming administration and public perceptions about that. How do you think the public is reacting to that? And also some questions surrounding a lot of Trump's bluster. That's what people are calling it, bluster, and his rhetoric around everything from taking over Canada to invading Mexico and the Panama Canal. How serious should we take that?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll jump in on that because it was funny. I was reading a quote about Greenland, actually, and I think it's actually one of the most brilliant assessments I've ever seen for Trump. It's by Kuno Fenker, which is a member of parliament in Greenland, I believe. And he says, "This is a great opportunity for Greenland," unquote. However, the quote continues, "We know Donald Trump. He's a politician. He's a businessman. You shouldn't take him literally, but you should always take him seriously." I think that sums it up pretty well. It's there's a lot about Donald Trump, but I think if you look at his cabinet picks and dig under the surface a bit beyond just looking at the ones that are getting in the news, you're seeing that he is largely seeking to enact what he spoke of on the campaign trail. The magnitude is a matter of discussion, right? When we talk about tariffs, is it 60% or is that a bargaining chip? Is that a statement? I mean, that's to be seen.
What do you think of that, Stefan? Yeah, shouldn't take him literally, but should take him seriously. And, you know, part of that, and Greenland, by the way, thanks for mentioning that, Justin. Greenland is also another one of those countries that he's saying, quoting Trump, this should be a part of the United States. Why not, right? So, you know, a lot of people very anxious about that. How should we take that? Literally,
Yeah,
seriously?
Both. I mean, like, look, I don't. Last I checked, you can't just go and just buy a country without their permission, or Denmark has. And I don't know the exact relationship or the sovereignty, how that works, but I know Denmark has to be involved and agree to it. And I mean, I think the last time there was a massive land purchase that I can remember was Alaska from Russia in 18 something. I'm going to forget the exact year. But I think, it's this, it sort of feels like there's been this period post-election where, it happened on the Democratic side. It was like, okay, resign to what just happened, feeling depressed, feeling like I'm just insulating and I'm not going to sort of pay attention. And now it's cropping up I think the memories of what 2017 through early 2021 was like. And now we're in the, I don't know, depression/anger phase of like, oh God, we have to go through another 4 years of this. Right. And I think, it's what, tends to work best for governments, what tends to work best for business, what tends to work best for the economy is predictability and stability. And I don't think we're going to have any of those three things over the next, certainly 2 years. And, what we're seeing so far it's been 1 day of hearings, but Hegseth, who's up for becoming, the head of the Department of Defense. It seems like what we're going to be looking at is a Republican Party where very few, if any, members are going to stand up and push back on what Trump wants to do. And if that's the case, it's going to be a really long 2 years. But this is the Senate. We'll see what happens in the House with the really small margin. So it's going to be, let's call it, interesting to say the least. But certainly, going back to the original question, it is, I think you have to take it seriously, and maybe not literally, but something close to it based on the past performance of Trump when he's in the White House.
Yeah. And also we have, well, at least according to Morning Consult, 32% of Americans just exhausted by politics. 2024 exhausted all of us, even those of us who are in the political space. We make a profession out of politics and public policy, public affairs, right? We're all exhausted by it. Obviously we were working in it, and people who are watching it unfold just completely depressed by it. How does that factor into this calculus as Trump moves in, opens up his new administration? How does that affect administration business? Also, the new appointees moving in to these new agencies and trying to run them. How much is that going to affect the administration being able to run itself and run the country? Go ahead, Justin.
General malaise about politics. I think that absolutely exists. I think it was one of the factors of the election, right? If you look at Trump's approval ratings, he's still upside down by 15 points, right? So he won the presidential election, but he's upside down in terms of approval, broadly speaking, by 15 points nationwide. So that malaise exists. Is very real. People are not happy with their politicians. They're not happy with their. Does this translate into, how does this translate in terms of effective governance? Well, I'm not seeing the total pearl clutching that I was seeing in the halls of government in the first election. In terms of those who are in government, I am seeing more of a degree of resignedness and how to approach it, how to approach one's own careers. I'm not saying that's everybody, but I see less breathlessness. And I say that with respect, by the way. I understand that people learn, but there was a heightened degree of vocalized concern and, if you will, panic at the first election. I'm not seeing that as pervasive this time around. I'm seeing it more in terms of a sense of how does one preserve, one's job role, one's purpose in the department they're in, and these kind of, I think they're more practical applications. Whether that's fully contentious in terms of the application of Trump's intent for governance, I don't know, because there's clearly an appetite for adjusting the scale, scope, and role of government on just about every aspect. I think some of the things that we can look to that are positive points for America. I think Stefan quite rightly pointed out that on predictability. Predictability is advantageous for most people who are in the business of planning, and most of us are in the business of planning, unless you're an historian and you're looking backwards, right? So whether you're in business or government or whatnot, you're on some form or another, you're planning towards the future. Predictability helps in that regard tremendously. The past administration wasn't completely, clean-handed in that regard. I mean, we're seeing clarity in spaces that may or may not help, depending on how you feel ideologically or business-wise. But we've actually, we're starting to see clarifications in terms of regulations around AI, regulations around crypto. These things are a part of the international world, and in some way, form, or another, are propelling wealth and innovation on a variety of different levels. I think this is a good thing. I don't think the atmosphere from the past 4 years was advantageous. In fact, I think it was quite disadvantageous towards those market spaces. Regardless, if let's just say for a moment, if you think crypto is a scam, fine. The underlying architecture of it, however, drives a lot of other things. And if you look at blockchain, which is the unheralded component of crypto, of course, it is a remarkable asset and something that the United States has done a pretty good job of trying to squish over 4 years, and I hope that we'll see some change in that regard. I'm just taking a snapshot. I get it. That's a vignette. We'll have to see how things shake out overall. Clearly, there's going to be disruptions, but I don't think that a lack of clarity is the problem here. I do think the president is enacting largely what the soon-to-be inaugurated president is enacting what he largely spoke of on the campaign trail and in rallies, to some extent with high, to some extent more clearly, to some extent on a platform. But I think if you look at his appointees and look at the structure of government he's creating, it's largely reflecting what he spoke about, whether you like it or don't like it. I think there's some clarity there.
Stefan, what are those top issues that you're expecting the president to work on? So Justin talking about, AI, crypto. Of course, we're going to expect this administration to get hawkish on China. Going to be a lot of talk about how to compete with China on the geopolitical stage, technology in terms of military issues as well. Also immigration, of course. A lot of people asking about, okay, he's promised to deport millions, to do forced deportation of millions of immigrants. And so people are wondering logistically what that looks like. Also, Americans, when you look at polling, most Americans are expecting that the industries that are going to most benefit from a Trump administration will be the financial services sector and also the technology sector. What are those top issues you think, Stefan, that the administration is going to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I believe it's like, look, I think there are two big ones, right? Immigration and then the Trump tax cuts, which are coming up towards the end of this year. And the big
the tariffs.
Yeah, and then we have to also sort of separate what can Trump or anyone in the White House do on their own, and then what does Congress need to do, right? So there's little stuff on immigration that the White House can do, but to really do the big plans that Trump is talking about, there needs to be congressional approval or a plan, or at least money put towards giving the White House a blank check, or whatever, blank check with a top number potentially to do what they want to do. And so then what has been the discussion around DC, at least on the Republican side, is are they going to do one reconciliation bill or two? And then for the reconciliation bill, what that is basically it can get fast tracked in the House because it's a financially based bill. This is sort of the I'll call it the Cliff Notes version, and mostly I believe correct. And then but the big thing is in the Senate, what allows is a 50 vote majority to get it passed. And I think the senators know they're not going to get 7 Democrats to go along with just about any of the plans Trump is talking about. So they really need to be at that 50 level. In the House, the Speaker, Johnson, was talking about doing one reconciliation bill that has everything. So the tax cuts, immigration, a whole bunch of other stuff that they would put in there. The Senate is moving forward, at least the last I saw, with the plan to go with 2 reconciliation bills, one immigration specific, and then the other one that is everything. So it's going to be interesting to see what they can get through. Now, I think if it ends up being one in the House, then I'm going to say they could probably end up making that happen. There'll be some belly aching and a lot of back scratching of how to get 100% of the Republicans to vote for it. But I think they could push that through. If it ends up being 2, I could see. I think the tax cuts go through relatively easy. I mean, they'll have a few folks who are going to ask for things, because they're saying they won't vote for anything that adds to the deficit, which there's no way you can do this and not add to the deficit. But then, that same thing with the immigration, where it's like, hey, if we're going to spend all this money, where's the money coming from? So they're going to have some difficulties getting things through the House. Senate, there's a little bit more cushion if they can do something that just needs the 50 votes, because they could lose 1 or 2, but then, they can't lose more than 3, right? 53 seats. Things I should know right off the top of my head. And then, then that gets it to the tie, and then, Vance will go along with whatever Trump wants. So really long way of saying, like, I think they have one shot in the beginning of getting stuff done, and then I think everything else becomes exceedingly difficult, and then you're just left with, what does Trump want to do, and what can he do through executive order and, moving budgets around, et cetera, that, the White House now has more power to do thanks to the Supreme Court. So now none of that is sort of like what is on the minds of most voters, right? Like most voters are, we want inflation to come down. We want prices to come down. We want to be able to, afford the lifestyle we would like to live. I mean, that is what the bread and butter issues are, what are driving most voters. But I don't necessarily think the White House cares about that in the big picture. It's more, hey, I want to do the couple things I said I want to do, and then, spend the next 3 years after that of setting myself up for life post White House.
Yeah. Hey, and real quick, I want to talk to you all about that. As we're talking about negotiations in Congress, reconciliation bills, et cetera. Right now, government's running on a CR, a continuing resolution in terms of the budget. Do we expect to shut down? And now, President Trump, or President-elect Trump, right now, in his first term, he does have the record where he doesn't have the record for most government shutdowns, right? So we see Ronald Reagan, I believe, who had the most government shutdowns, but Donald Trump does have the record for most days of a government shutdown. So, there's some worry there. What are you thinking, Justin? You expect a government shutdown after the CR ends?
Government shutdowns are interesting. They typically are a complete failure for Republicans in the eyes of the voters. Republicans tend to wave the flag of saying, hey, we got a government shutdown. This is good. Aren't we triumphant? We're forcing something. And 9 times out of 10, voters look at it and say, I hate this and you're at fault, Republicans, because they view it as incompetence, right? The government should work. That's broadly perceived. If the government's shut down, it means someone failed at their job. This is where it gets a little bit tricky with Trump, because like that friend at a party who can ask you to pull his finger and gets away with it, right? But the rest of us can't. So the question is, can he do that and be effective? And I think, and I'm not a fan of shutting the government down, but this is not a show about what my opinions are. I think that he is going to use that as a tool, and I don't think he's going to shy away from it. And I think that is enhanced by the fact that he is a lame duck president. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's government shutdowns. I don't think that's good for the American people overall. I don't think it is good for their faith in the government. But who cares what I think? I think that's going to be a tool that's going to be used.
Yeah, and there's some also, I'm sure, worries and concerns over a government shutdown, especially when this particular CR, continuing resolution, expires. Stefan, also price concerns, inflation causing price concerns. It looks like, just according to recent government data, consumer prices, the consumer price index going up over 2%. Obviously, that's not going to make consumers happy. Some of that is, since it's the incoming administration, people aren't going to think about the last administration. They're just going to think about the administration that's in place. How much does that impact or affect Trump?
Yeah, the plus side for Republicans is they're in charge of everything right now. The negative side is they're in charge of everything right now. So look, obviously not a fan, but Trump is a very good communicator. He is very good at spinning things in a way that, makes him look good, makes him look strong, etc. Maybe he could pull it off, but I am not sure how, when you have the White House, the House, the Senate, if there's a long-term shutdown, how you're not taking the blame from most voters if that happens, right? So if the Democrats had held on to the Senate, you have they're the ones, you can just start pointing fingers. But if you can't even wrangle your own party to vote for the things your party says they want, you take the blame, you take the fault, right? So and then the big question becomes, will Democrats do anything to help? Now you get into the what is tactically good and what is actually good for the country, right? So on a tactical side, my answer is I hope they do nothing, right? Look, you guys laid this bed, you get to make it. But at the same time, obviously a government shutdown hurts lots and lots of people, and it is the worst thing possible. But, I would never recommend you just go along with it to go along with it, that you have to get something for those votes, right? So if the Republicans can't do it themselves, then the speaker better be coming to Democrats with open arms and say, what do you need in order to get this moved through? And I
Yeah, and
don't.
that's real quick, Stefan. Just don't mean to cut you off, but want to ask you or make this point. That is a real habit of Democrats, and especially over the past 20 years, or at least that I've seen, since the Iraq War, right, in the wake of 9/11, Democrats just and later on regretting it, just signing on, putting a rubber stamps, going along with what Republicans want to do. Particularly if there's a big public push behind it or major public anxiety behind it. And at a later point, Democrats end up regretting that. And so politically, that ends up being a landmine for them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's going to accuse the Democrats of being a super well-run party that's strategic and, is good at winning elections. I mean, I think there's a pretty solid history over the last, let's say 20 plus years of, not doing a good job. And I don't think Democrats have adjusted super well to sort of our new political reality, since the 1990s, which is, it's not just about governing, where, pre 1994, and I'm, again, going with a huge generalization here, but in general, you had two parties that were working off agreed upon facts with a different view of how to get to similar desired outcomes. And then, starting in 1994, that dynamic definitely changed and shifted, right? Where it's a lot more about the brand and winning elections. Again, disagreements can be had on this generalization, but going with that premise, the Democrats just have not adjusted well to that, because ultimately, still a party that believes in government, wants government to run well, and is trying to quote unquote do the right thing. Not to say that everyone agrees with their positions, but that's sort of the approach that they're taking, and that doesn't lend itself super well to the current world that we live in right now. And I think some. I would argue like Pelosi did a very good job of running the House and running the caucus. It seems like Jeffries is doing a pretty good job of it as well. I mean, Pelosi's a whole other level, just given her experience in being able to run the caucus. But the Senate is always trickier, and they have not adjusted as well. And you always have a lot of individuals thinking they're the most important thing. So it's a lot harder to wrangle folks on the Senate side than it is in the House.
Hey, Justin, you've got many corporations who are now feeling a lot more comfortable with an incoming Trump administration. Many corporations, in fact, going to subsidize or fund the inauguration, right? That's rather unusual. That's something unprecedented. Typically the inauguration is a publicly funded event, and now you're having corporations, you're having a variety, it's whether it's Google or Facebook or Meta or Amazon or someone else. Now they're all, sort of all bowing down. In fact, there was a Washington Post cartoonist that recently resigned because of a controversial cartoon that shows corporations and Mickey Mouse bowing down to a statue of Trump. So now corporations are going to have to play some really tricky balancing acts here. And will it affect their brands? That's something that you look at very closely. How much do they have to navigate all this? How much do they have to also reassess their brands or how they go about marketing those brands?
Well, a couple things. It's a minor deviation from what you said. It's not as if corporations don't contribute to every inauguration. They do. I mean,
right.
Obama's inauguration was contributed to by corporations. Biden's was. They all are. I mean, the question is, are you disclosing them? And if you accept federal money as part of your funding, then you have to disclose those, right? And correct me if my details are incorrect, but that's broadly what it is, right? So what Trump said is, I don't need the federal funding, and I don't care about disclosing, so I'll just keep the corporate money. So first off, it's not like it's such a dramatic difference. if you have all the money in the world, why do you really need to take federal money? I think that's a fairly reasonable argument, right? That allows independence. That's actually an American thing. So moving on to the vast amounts of money that corporations are shoveling at the president, clearly it's for influence. Of course it's for influence, as they are with every president who's inaugurated. That's not just because you're my friend. That's because I want something from you. You help your friend move. You don't give your friend $20 million. This is actually long established tradition of politics. Now, will it help? Right. We spoke a little bit earlier. Stefan mentioned maybe Charles, it was you. Forgive me if I've confused it. That there will be some advantage to tech in the upcoming administration. I feel differently. I don't think there's going to be an advantage for tech. I think tech has a long history that they're now paying for of being the arbiters of truth. That is not something that's appetizing to the American people. That's one of the drivers of the past elections tumult on both sides, by the way. And they are seeing that there are repercussions for that. It's one thing to be a speech forum, as ugly and horrible and disjointed as that is, because speech is ugly. It's another to moderate that speech and decide what is truth and not truth. You find out later that what you thought was truth may not have been as clear as you thought it was at the time, and you're driving conversations that, frankly, you're going to be responsible for later on. They're seeing that, and they're changing their tune. Maybe because they just want to curry favor, but they are paying a price for having done that. I think that price is going to continue to be paid. That has a long, long tail, right? When you have tremendous power over governing what people say and you have used it, that is a problem in a free society. That is a problem to American voters. Largely, some voters support it, but largely, a majority and upwards, American voters think you should be able to say what you want, even if it's ugly and distasteful and nasty. So I don't think tech has got a free ride on this at all. I think they're turning around because they see the writing on the wall. They see there's a problem. I think that a lot of big business sees this as well. There's certain industries that I think are very, very much in the line of fire. I think PBMs, for example, are very, very much the sort of target that the Trump administration will view as easy populist pickings. I think a number of those kinds of spaces that are, they may have been in tumult of some form or another in the past. They're really going to be in an existential crisis moving forward. The corporations you're exactly right. Corporations are embracing Trump in a very different way than they did the first term. I think that's largely driven by pragmatism. They want to save their own skin.
The other thing too, what's interesting here, Justin, is that this is much different from how corporations. It seems to me like here in 2025, this is much different from how reacted to Trump being elected in 2016, right?
Absolutely.
How they came in, they distanced themselves. I seemed like in 2017 with that inauguration, right, Justin? And so it's a little bit different now, I guess.
Absolutely right. The distinction is night and day, and I didn't intend to suggest that it wasn't. It is completely different. Corporations are embracing Trump, and they distance themselves en masse in 2016, 2017. There's no question about that. When you look at the inaugural stands during the swearing in, right next to the president and the former presidents, and all of these folks who are truly globally important, you will also have those who are financially important. You'll have Zuckerberg, who has a contentious past relationship. You'll have Elon Musk, of course, and you'll have others that are clear business interests that are sitting, if not directly right hand, then one place removed right hand, and they paid for that. So yes, there is an absolute stark difference between the open arms that the corporate America is displaying towards the president now than they displayed in the first term.
Hey, Justin, I want to ask you about, or Justin, it seems like you have some thoughts about that. Go ahead.
Oh, Stefan. I was totally agree in that, 2016, there was, I think, a view that this was a mistake, or people didn't, the voters didn't really know what they were getting. So, again, not said in those exact words, although sometimes I'm sure they probably were. But now it's just, look, you had 4 years of this. Trump on the campaign trail was nothing but, I would say, honest about what he thinks and what he's planning on doing, and he won, right? And won the popular vote. You can't even say, oh, this is just a fluke of the system. I mean, now didn't win a majority, but won the popular vote. And so I think it's definitely a different dynamic going into this. And I think the only, I wouldn't say it that a lot of companies aren't embracing Trump as much as they are positioning themselves to ideally, what they think is going to be advantageous to them. Now, I think, I agree with some of Justin's points on, I don't think this is, going to be an easy road for tech in that, look, yes, sucking up to Trump right off the beginning, giving money, all the changes and the BS that was coming out of Meta, it's going to endear them to Trump for at least the short term. But, again, if past this prologue, it's not Trump is not a predictable human, and he will do what he wants to do. And the second he feels that you're going against him or you don't do the exact thing that he wanted, then, you're going to have problems. So it's not just, oh, write out your check for $1 million and you're going to have no problems for the next 4 years. And then I think, the other interesting dynamic that this brings to the table that we were just talking about is, you're seeing already a division within the Trump supporters, right? So, and this popped up with the H-1B1 visa issue online where, all of a sudden it's Musk and Ramaswamy against Bannon and, Laura, totally blank on her name, Laura Loomer. And, so it's this sort of what is America first? If you're generalizing the two sides, the tech side is what's good for America is to make my business and all businesses as much profit as humanly possible. And if that means bringing in foreign workers, then let's do that. And the other side is no, America first means putting Americans in every single job and keeping out foreigners. And these two sides are not going to get along very well for too long, I wouldn't think.
Mm-hmm. This also brings to mind the next sort of contradictory decision that this administration, or seemingly contradictory decision that this administration appears to make or is about to make once it gets into place about TikTok, or with respect to TikTok. I'm thinking that the administration is setting the stage for being neo-isolationist and for being a hawk on China or China's expansion. TikTok is Chinese owned, right? And there was a movement, especially with the Biden administration, to ban TikTok because of TikTok's influence on American audiences and worries over what that meant in terms of geopolitics, in terms of tensions between the U.S. and China. Justin, what's going on there? I mean, why would the Trump administration suddenly want to reverse that ban while at the same time say, hey, you know what? We don't want any more Chinese competition. We want to be a hedge against that. I'm not clear on that. And a lot of other folks aren't clear on that either.
I think it's a structural thing. It's a governance thing, corporate governance, right? So, I mean, if TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, then it is by law obliged to turn over its whatever. It's you name it, you have to give it to the Chinese government. So TikTok collects a lot of data on its users, and that is strategic, valuable data. That's what the U.S. government's concerned about. And they have reason to be concerned. China has the most effective overseas spying program pretty much of all time, exceeding the sword and the shield of the good old KGB in Cold War times, which was pretty effective. And they have found ways into pretty much all of our key systems, our electricity systems, our water systems, in many cases our defense systems, the highest levels of government. China is behaving like an adversary. So if a Chinese company has access to vast troves of international data, specifically American data, then of course the U.S. government, I think arguably has some reason to be concerned about that. The structural component is, do you break off a component of TikTok to be TikTok US, right? And is that owned by a US firm and operated firm and independent of sucking data out to the Chinese government. There's a whole lot of things that are much more difficult to actually do on the back end, because one of the things TikTok does is take an evaluation of all past behavior, right, and apply it to algorithms and so forth. And that's part of the value proposition for creators and so forth. So it's a lot easier said than done. But I think that's what's really about, is the question of, yes, TikTok is popular. Is there a way to do it? And if we split it in two, well, maybe we can have our cake and eat it too. I don't think it's anything more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say it's because like Trump has over like I think it's like 100 million followers or 10 million followers, whatever it is on TikTok. He's got a lot of followers, and all of a sudden he's like, oh, I like this. People like me, and it worked for me, so therefore I'm going to get it. But I mean, I think, look, the odds of TikTok or the Chinese government being like, yes, we're going to sell this or we're going to sell off a piece of it, I think is pretty doubtful that they would agree to anything like that. I also think it's doubtful that teens and other people who are big users of TikTok aren't going to find ways around any kind of ban. And from a TikTok perspective, I think it's something like the U.S. is obviously a big market, but I think it's 75% of their users are outside of the U.S. So it's not like, oh, the U.S. doesn't ban TikTok and all of a sudden this company is going out of business. They'll be fine. And again, I think most, a lot of people will find ways around any kind of app ban or anything like that.
Also another conversation about tariffs, right? Trump and Republicans really big on imposing tariffs on not just an adversary like China, but also a number of other countries, countless other countries, saying, products coming from other countries going into America will have tariffs imposed on them. Of course, looking at Morning Consult data, which is showing 42% of Americans are expecting price increases with those tariffs, but they're underestimating tariff impacts over the short term and long term. And it's also causing a lot of Republican voters to also underestimate it, but that's causing problems for Democrats and economists in trying to persuade Republican voters that, hey, this might not be such a good thing. I don't know your thoughts on that, Stefan, in terms of where we go politically. While we're seeing all sorts of data showing that tariffs aren't the best thing because it's going to cost a lot of money. I was going to put those cost burdens on consumers, but it seems like President-elect Trump or President now coming within very soon, President Trump and Republicans want to go with that.
Yeah, I mean, I and this is always hard to say, but I think we're at a point where Democrats just have to be like, F it. Like, you want to do this, this is yours, go do it. And it is going to be horrible because there is no data, there is nothing that points to, like blanket tariffs are a good idea, right? Like, we know that this is going to hurt American manufacturers. We know this is going to kill American consumers. It's going to be terrible for the economy. But at a certain point, I think you just have to be like, Republicans want their rope, here you go. Like, good luck, and let's see what happens. I mean, there's a time and a place for tariffs. But and that's typically when and I know this has been an issue with like steel coming out of China, right? So that basically they're selling it under market in order to put other manufacturers out of business, and then you're fixing that issue through tariffs by not allowing them to sell undervalued materials. Now, with something like, hey, just anything that comes in from our two biggest traders, Mexico and Canada, we're going to put 20% on top of it. That just gets handed right over to the American consumer. And if you think prices were bad during the inflationary period after the pandemic, you haven't seen anything yet. And ultimately, it's going to be the consumers and the manufacturers that are going to pay the price. But I do not think Democrats are going to be able or have the capability of really explaining this in a way that the average American consumer will understand unless they feel it. And again, it somewhat pains me to say it because again, the ramifications are going to be terrible. But I think this is just a thing where it's got to be like, this is on you. Like, and we can't stop it, and we're not. Just good luck. You own this one.
Yeah. Justin, I want to get your thoughts. And another thing too is that there is this assumption that explaining the problems associated with tariffs, like Democrats trying to warn Republican voters that there are going to be consequences with tariffs, is really not something that will pay off politically. There are signs of that. There are signs that Republican voters will get a little stubborn and still back Trump. They'll see it as political retribution from Democrats. So, how do you message? Any advice on how you can actually message tariffs or the consequences of tariffs?
Well, first off, I do see a fairly significant amount of skepticism about the value of tariffs across the board with American voters, including Republicans, right? So what I'm seeing is they're looking at it as a tool, which sounds like they've been listening to, to how Trump is positioning them. And they understand that on a geopolitical basis, it is a tool of some value. Their question is, how does it affect them? This is what I'm seeing a lot. And as you would imagine, I mean, we're all kind of doing some sort of research in this space, moving into this month. And their concern is it going to hurt American manufacturing? Is it going to hurt American farmers? Are the prices that are increased being passed along to me? Am I going to pay more? Exactly like Stefan was saying. And they recognize that there are potentially real consequences to that. There are also those who feel that tariffs are being used for non-economic reasons in this case, right? So I mean, one of the reasons why Mexico is facing tariffs is not because they're offloading cheap aluminum. It's because of fentanyl and illegal immigration or undocumented immigration. That's why the president's using this particular leverage. It seems some folks look at that and say use whatever tool is possible. Some folks look at that and say, well, it seems like the two don't really marry up in terms of appropriate tools for the do. The point I'm trying to make is I think American voters have a tolerance for tariffs. Keep in mind that these are not overwhelmingly approved by any measure. I mean, I think they're approved by 40% or something like that right now. So they're upside down in terms of voter approval. There's a limited tolerance for them being used as a negotiation tool towards furthering those ends of various, topics that were important during the election. Immigration clearly was one. Fentanyl is one, and drug abuse and stemming that flow. There's an appetite to change what is perceived as an inverse relationship in terms of advantage between China and cheap labor and the goods that they put forth into the world, competing with ours. Those kind of three core pillars, if those are addressed in any meaningful way in fairly rapid order, I believe that Americans have an appetite for. I agree completely that the long-term unintended consequences, if they're allowed to play out, will be a very real problem for Republicans moving forward. If I was advising the Democrats, I would advise them to do exactly what Stefan is saying, which I don't know is killing him. I would say, let this play out and speak about inflation, speak about the cost to your pocketbook, and then you keep that drumbeat going on because it will eventually happen. And if you message simply and concisely and clearly, and if it does continue, people are going to see it and they're not going to have an appetite for it. If it happens quickly and is over, well, then it's, no one's going to care.
We are looking at the intensification of climate change related disasters. Obviously, we're seeing what's happening right now in California, more specifically, Los Angeles, the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area, those wildfires raging there is climate change related because, as the old classic Tony Tone song goes, it never rains in Southern California, right? And so Southern California hadn't been getting much rain. It's been very, very dry out there. And as a result, you're going to have wildfires happen, climate change related, very intense hurricanes happening in the Southeast, Hurricane Helene and also Milton. Those are massive, very expensive disasters. And so we're seeing a lot of political fallout from these disasters. And those disasters are promising to intensify. So what happens now? What happens next with all of those? Obviously seeing political fallout for the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, and the governor, Gavin Newsom. But how are at-large Republicans and Democrats going to handle this? How are Republican and Democratic voters going to respond to it? clearly Republicans, the right, not believing in climate change, but then they're going to see these disasters unfold more intensely. Democrats, of course, more likely to believe in climate change, and they're going to more and more ask for something to be done. How do we approach this, Stefan?
How should we or how will we? Because I think those are two very different. Different
how
answers,
should
right?
we? Right.
And it is like, and this kind of goes back to the previous conversation as well, right? So from the Democratic perspective, I think you have to look at it like, what can we actually do and what can we actually stop, right? I don't think there's much proactive work to be done, at least on the federal level. And climate change, I think, is on the list, unfortunately, of like, what do you actually expect you could do? And there's maybe a few things you might be able to stop, but there's certainly nothing proactive you're going to be able to do over the next 2 years, other than are there changes that could happen where you just want the Republican Party to have to own that? Again, the ramifications of that are terrible, because if you're doing bad things and even worse things happen, that affects actual people, and it's very hard to disconnect sort of the political gamesmanship with the actual results. But and then globally, there's this movement towards a more populist view, and and being more centered on the country that people live in, and ultimately, we're not in a global period of cooperation, and and certainly not happening in the United States. So I think this is one of those issues that it is going to be it's bad, and it's going to get worse. And and I think this is where Republicans are saying, hey, like, I don't think we should give any funding to California, because screw them, because wokeness. Like, look, you're not going to solve it right now. So I think Democrats have to start being like, fine, next hurricane that hits Florida, screw you. Like, you're on your own. And ultimately, I think this is where we are until enough of the American public is willing to go back to a serious view of government, and in that, like, look, it's not about agreeing with one party or another, but it's like, look, we need to put adults in the room that want to solve problems and start addressing problems. And we can't just say, like, get rid of regulation, cut all taxes, and let her live our lives, and everything's going to work out like perfectly. It's just not how the world works. But like, we need more people need to be at the place of pushing back against this, whatever MAGA view of the world, and getting back to being adults.
What do you think, Justin, in terms of when will that pivot point happen, right? As these storms, these disasters intensify, clearly climate change being instigated, pushed by use of, increasing ongoing use of fossil fuels, right? Just more and more carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, and that's obviously creating those kinds of disruptions. But when will the pivot point happen? Where will it get to a point where it's going to force not just the American public, but this incoming administration to say, we're probably going to need to do something here, whether it's, in terms of how the federal government responds to it, can't be so political about it, can't be, imposing so much political fallout. We're just going to have to do something here, be, like Justin said, the adults in the room.
So I'm seeing a lot of interesting stuff. I'm a California boy, so I obviously do a lot of work.
Exactly,
in California.
Yeah.
And obviously doing work now and speaking to people in California. And I think there's a sea change. I think it's slightly different than the nature of the conversation that we've had so far today. I'm not seeing the division. I'm seeing it in memes and social media. I'm not seeing the division being, is climate change a problem? There's always going to be a division there, right? There are people who believe it, there are people who don't believe it. I'm not seeing a division in terms of certain social consciousness things, like DEI. I'm seeing that on social media. I'm not seeing it with voters. I'm seeing something very important in terms of adults in the room and governance, which Stefan was speaking to. And that has been not addressed in California, but there is a massive appetite for it that is swollen since these past fires. And that is predictability, right? These things, let's just take California, for example, and it may not be the best example because California wildfires are far more predictable than a lot of other things, but a lot of these things are predictable. They happen in regions where they happen. California's been on fire for several thousand years. It burns. We know it burns. We also know that there are ways to mitigate that. We know that if you clean brush, that it meaning fuel, if you remove fuel, then that will mitigate the spread of wildfires, even in highly difficult conditions like Santa Ana winds, which have been around for thousands of years. We know this, and yet it hasn't been followed, and it hasn't been prosecuted over the past 40 years, whereas it was for quite some time in the 20th century to reasonable effect. We also know that dousing a fire, the putting out of fire, is theoretically fairly straightforward. You take a something that quenches a fire, usually water, and you douse it on the fire. That requires water supplies that are placed a highly vulnerable area that are reliable. This is a gravity issue and storage issue, both of which have been spoken of as complex. They're complex because of the regulations that are imposed upon them by California, not so much in terms of the complexity of connecting to a municipal water network. That is mildly complex. This is a state that was responsible for the aerospace industry that sent men around the moon and to the moon using computers that were as functional as basically me doing arithmetic in my head. These are not issues that America can't solve. These are not issues that any country can't solve, and these are not issues that a California can't solve. They are issues that have been put aside in favor of other expenditures. So what I'm seeing now is not that people are saying, listen, these climate change things are not worthwhile. They're looking at it and saying, first off, we need to protect those of us who live here. That's a reasonable expectation. And by the way, the ramifications of wildfires and things like that actually have a direct and massive impact to our climate. And we need to mitigate that. And we know how to mitigate. And why haven't we done it? And the deepest of deep blue Californians are asking that. I think it's a turning point. It is time for adults in the room.
Yeah, turning point. And, even though, people ask, even though we do know that there are ways to mitigate that, still, this is rather unusual, unprecedented, with California and places like, especially Southern California, being this dry, right? It hasn't been as dry as it's been, and, scientists calling it hydroclimate whiplash, what's kind of causing these conditions. And, now not being able to foresee or envision any major wet weather coming into the region anytime soon. And so, the other thing is not just California, but it's just elsewhere. When will the turning point happen where, and people worried now, the new administration, when those disasters happen, what kind of resources will the government have, will be willing to share to make sure that those impacts are mitigated?
And I think that's a reasonable question. And I hope we don't devolve into a tit for tat that was described by Stefan, which I think I also am worried about. I think that's very realistic in a politically charged environment. But I think it's perfectly reasonable for any federal government to question whether a state and the local and regional municipalities have actively and responsibly engaged in preparation. And if the answer is no, then they need to sit down and negotiate a bit to figure out how to get from A to B. Does it mean cutting off aid? Absolutely not. I would hope not. Any human, human interested, even with the slightest sense of humanity, would not want that. But it is certainly an opportunity to discuss: have we engaged in prevention efforts to the degree we need to, that we know how to do, and that we actually, is one of the richest areas in the world, can do? Or have we not? And do we need to give some attention to that? I think that's a perfectly reasonable discussion to have, and I think it would be an absolute tragedy if it's not undertaken.
Yeah, last thoughts on that, Stefan?
Yeah, no, and I think, look, there's just a much bigger conversation that needs to be having, and to Justin's point, right? Like and this is not like one party or the other, right? But it's different reactions to what's going on, and lots of things that aren't helping, right? So if in California, for example, right, it's like, hey, you have to, most people want insurance on their home, right? And then then the insurance companies were being like, we are no longer going to cover fire in this area because we're just losing our shirts, and we can't make the numbers work anymore, right? And then California came in and was like, well, we're going to backstop these insurance policies. So if they're massive, fires, we'll cover it. way oversimplifying what happened, but like the general gist, right? So basically, the government came in and was like, okay, we'll backstop the insurance industry on this so that Californians can have insurance and things like that. So basically, what the government was doing was taking away the price of having a home in this specific area. Now, there's a logic to it in that, like, look, we need more housing. We have more people. People need to live places. If we don't have, more housing, then housing prices go up. It's impossible to find anything affordable. I mean, that's hard enough as it is. Then questions about cutting down regulation on, like, so that you can build more houses more quickly. But it's like, look, if we're having an adult conversation, it's like, look, there have to be or if you're going to build in a place that is near a fire zone, or if you're going to build a house that is near the ocean, like, you should do things in order to, like, make it so that this house isn't going to collapse, burn, go into the water. And that means, yes, like regulation, which is a 4-letter word for a lot of people, but it's like, but at the same, and it's also like, look, I think there also has to be like, look, if you're going to build in this area, you're kind of on your own, and we're not going to backstop that. It's so that people start making, I'll call it like smarter decisions in terms of where they're building or where they're rebuilding. And all of those are really tough, unpopular, hard conversations to be having. But, we have to hope and push for adults to be around the table and start having these conversations.
All right. I think, Stefan, you're going to get the last word here in our discussion. Stefan Hankin is founder, CEO of Lincoln Park Strategies. Go to lpstrategies.com. Also founder, CEO of Trendancy. Go to trendancy.com for more there. And then we're joined by also Justin Wallen, one of our partners of J. Wallen Opinion Research. Go to jwallen.com for more there. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm your host for this episode of What Comes Next. And looking forward to next month for that conversation next month. By that time, we'll have like a fully formal Trump administration. So it's going to be a lot happening between now and then. So it's going to be really interesting to see what's all changed. And so for any more information on me, you can go to the bnote.com or strategybe.com. Also subscribe while you're doing that to the bnote.com as well. You can find episodes and also previous episodes of this conversation there. So we'll see you next time. Be safe out there.